The gold coin didn't just drop, it rang. It struck the scarred floorboards of Hobson's General Store so hard that the afternoon chatter died instantly, leaving 11 people holding their breath. For 9 long years, Red Hollow had watched Clara Whitmore starve politely. They turned her into a local story, the hard-working girl who never complained, a neat narrative for townsfolk to feel warm about while no one brought her a single bowl of soup. Meanwhile, her 11-year-old brother Toby was fading behind a bedroom wall, and Clara was down to a 4-day countdown before the town doctor walked away for good. Then he walked in. A ragged traveler wearing cracked boots and a split leather coat, smelling of pine smoke and cold wind. He didn't ask. He dropped a fortune in pure gold onto the counter and delivered a chilling proposition. "Marry me. I don't know your name, but your brother's got 4 days." The town laughed. Del Rugard grinned by the stove, waiting for everyone to join in. But nobody laughed, because inside her chest something wild and desperate began to beat. Clara didn't know it yet, but this poor, rough mountain man wasn't just a drifter off the road. He carried a 14,000-acre secret, a box of 31 letters from a shared past, and a quiet, terrifying resolve to upend every polite lie the town had built around her. Stay with me all the way to the end, because the legacy this cowboy is hiding will break your heart before it heals it. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind coming off the timberline ridge didn't just blow, it scraped. It carried the bitter bite of frozen pine and wet earth, dragging it relentlessly across the grand stone steps of Abbott Manor. Ruth Abbott knelt on the second step, her knees bruising against the frost-heaved granite. She wore a coarse gray cotton apron pulled tight over a faded brown dress, the cuffs worn straight through to the pale threads beneath. Beside her, a wooden bucket of lye water had already formed a thin, jagged crust of ice. Ruth plunged the stiff bristles of her scrub brush into the freezing water, ignoring the sharp sting. Her knuckles were raw, the skin split and bleeding in faint red lines that washed away in the gray suds. She scrubbed the stone until her shoulders burned, her breath coming in short, white plumes that vanished into the harsh afternoon air. Deep in the right pocket of her apron, her numb fingers curled around a small wooden sewing spool. The wood was smooth, carved with 2 faded initials she could trace without looking. It was the only thing in the world she actually owned. Everything else, the dress on her back, the roof she slept under, the very name she carried, belonged to Silas Abbott. "You missed a spot by the pillar." The voice was warm and entirely unbothered by the cold. Ruth didn't look up. She kept her head bowed as Beatrice Abbott, wrapped in a heavy burgundy wool cloak lined with silver fox fur, stepped out onto the porch. Beatrice didn't look at Ruth as a sister or even as a servant. She looked at her the way one might look at a stubborn stain on the floorboards. "Father is expecting a guest," Beatrice said, her leather-gloved hand resting on the polished brass rail. "He wants the courtyard immaculate. Do try not to bleed on the stone, Ruth. It defeats the purpose of washing it." "Yes, Beatrice," Ruth said quietly. Her voice was steady, stripped of any defiance that might earn her a night without firewood. That was the rule of Abbott Manor. You survived by becoming invisible. You endured by becoming useful. Beatrice huffed a small breath of amusement and walked down the steps, her heavy skirts brushing past Ruth's freezing hands. As the carriage carried the favored daughter away toward town, the heavy oak doors of the manor creaked open behind Ruth. The whispers of the household staff drifted out into the freezing air, carried by the frantic energy of a house preparing for an execution. "They say he's completely ruined," Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, muttered to a passing maid. "The banks took the High Pine Mill last Tuesday, took the land, took the timber, took the horses." "Then why is Mr. Abbott letting him in the front door?" the maid whispered back. "Because he owes Silas Abbott $3,000, and a ruined man is a desperate man. They say he's coming to offer a marriage to settle the ledger. He's looking to claim one of the daughters to tie the remaining Thorne name to the Abbott money." Ruth kept scrubbing, but her hands slowed. The Thorne name. Everyone in the valley knew of the Thornes. Once they had owned the very timber that built Abbott Manor. But the father had died, the empire had crumbled, and the son had vanished into the high country, living like a wild mountain man while the banks devoured his inheritance. Now, Garrett Thorne was coming down from the ridge, a bankrupt heir, a desperate man with nothing left to his name but debts and pride. And Silas Abbott, a man who traded human dignity like currency, was waiting for him in the drawing room, ready to humiliate the last Thorne for sport. The crunch of heavy boots on the frozen gravel stopped the whispers instantly. Ruth froze. She hadn't heard a carriage. She hadn't heard a horse. He must have walked the 3 miles up the valley road in the dead of winter. She turned her head, her breath catching in her throat. A man stood at the edge of the courtyard. He did not look like a beggar. He did not look like a man who had lost an empire. He stood tall, his frame wire-muscled and grounded like granite. He wore a dust-covered canvas coat that fell past his hips, and faded denim trousers tucked into muddy, battered boots. The wind whipped at his short, dark hair, revealing an angular face weathered by brutal sun and biting cold. A thin, faded scar cut across his left cheekbone, pale against his sun-darkened skin. But it was his eyes that made the breath stall in Ruth's chest. They were a sharp, piercing amber brown, scanning the grand facade of Abbott Manor, not with awe, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a man measuring timber for the axe. He didn't move toward the door immediately. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his canvas coat and pulled out a silver pocket watch. The crystal face was severely cracked. Click! The sound of the silver casing snapping shut echoed across the frozen courtyard, sharp as a gunshot. Garrett Thorne stepped forward. His boots left heavy, deliberate prints in the frost. As he reached the base of the stone steps, he stopped. He looked down at the bucket of iced lye water. He looked at the gray suds freezing on the granite, and then, slow, his sharp amber eyes moved up to find Ruth. Ruth instinctively pulled her bleeding, raw hands into the folds of her apron, a sudden flare of shame burning in her cheeks. She was used to being looked down upon, used to being ignored. But the way this ragged, ruined mountain man looked at her wasn't with pity, and it wasn't with cruelty. He looked at her with an absolute, terrifying stillness. "The water's frozen," Garrett said. His voice was a low, rough rasp, like heavy timber dragging over stone. It carried the faint, cold scent of pine. "I have to finish the steps, sir," Ruth whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "Mr. Abbott is expecting a guest." Garrett held her gaze for one long, agonizing second. He didn't offer a polite smile. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He simply looked at her raw, bleeding knuckles hidden in her apron, then looked at the heavy oak doors of the manor. "He is," Garrett said quietly. He stepped past her, the hem of his canvas coat brushing against her shoulder. As he walked into the house that treated her like dirt, Ruth clutched the carved wooden spool in her pocket, a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread settling in her stomach. Silas Abbott was waiting inside to offer a daughter to a ruined man. And Silas Abbott never gave away anything of value. The drawing room of Abbott Manor was suffocatingly warm, heavy with the scent of polished mahogany, expensive cigar smoke, and imported floral perfume. It was a room designed to make men feel small. Silas Abbott sat behind his massive desk, a ledger open before him, his manicured fingers steepled beneath his chin. Garrett Thorne stood in the dead center of the Persian rug. He hadn't bothered to wipe his boots. The melting frost mixed with mountain mud, leaving dark, ugly stains on the pristine woven wool. He did not remove his hat. He did not shift his weight. He stood with the unnatural, unnerving stillness of a man used to waiting out a blizzard in the high country, his canvas coat dripping slowly onto the floor. $3,000, Garrett, Silas said, breaking the silence. He leaned back, a smug smile stretching across his well-fed face. That is what your father's name is worth today, nothing more. I heard the bank chained the gates of the High Pine Mill this morning. A tragedy, really. A titan of the timber industry, reduced to a beggar in muddy denim. Garrett did not blink. His amber-brown eyes remained locked on the older man, flat and unreadable. The debt is $3,000. Garrett's voice was a low rasp, cutting through the warm air like a rusted saw. I came to clear the ledger. Silas let out a short, patronizing laugh. With what? Pine cones? You don't have a dime, Thorne. Everyone in the valley knows you've been living like a wild animal up on the ridge since the money dried up. Silas closed the ledger with a sharp snap. I know why you're here. You want Beatrice. You think tying your ruined name to my daughter will stop the creditors from picking your bones clean. Garrett said nothing. His silence seemed to irritate Silas, who preferred men who begged or blustered when cornered. I will not give my flesh and blood to a bankrupt mountain man, Silas sneered, his true cruelty finally surfacing. Beatrice is meant for a governor's son, not a savage who sleeps in the dirt. But, Silas's eyes gleamed with a sudden vicious amusement, I am a merciful man, and I do have a surplus in this house. Silas reached across his desk and rang a small brass bell. A moment later, the heavy oak doors opened. Mrs. Gable stood in the doorway, pushing a trembling figure forward into the room. It was Ruth. She stood frozen on the edge of the expensive rug, the bucket of lye water abandoned in the hall. Her coarse gray apron was damp, the hem of her brown dress stiff with cold. She instinctively hid her hands in the folds of her apron, desperately trying to conceal her raw, bleeding knuckles. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, her deep blue eyes darting from Silas Abbott's cruel smile to the imposing back of the stranger in the canvas coat. This is Ruth, Silas announced, gesturing toward her as if presenting a slightly defective piece of furniture. She is a ward of this house, a charity case my late wife took in. She costs me more in firewood and bread than she earns in labor. Ruth stopped breathing. She knew that tone. It was the tone Silas used when he was negotiating the sale of a lame horse. She is entirely unremarkable, Silas continued, enjoying the sound of his own voice. But she knows how to scrub a floor, she doesn't eat much, and she's used to the cold. She's sturdy enough for whatever miserable cabin you're squatting in." Silas leaned forward, tapping a pen against the desk. "Sign a marriage contract today. Take her out of my sight, and I will strike the $3,000 debt from my ledger. You walk away free of me, and she becomes your problem. That is my only offer, Thorn." The room went deathly quiet. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner dared to make a sound. Ruth's vision blurred. The edges of the room began to tilt. Traded for a debt. The words echoed in her skull, sharp and violently cold. She was 21 years old, and her entire life, her dignity, her future, had just been priced at $3,000 of a dead man's debt. She was not a person to Silas Abbott. She was collateral. She was property. She looked at the mountain man, expecting him to laugh, expecting him to demand a better bargain. Garrett turned slowly. He looked at her. Ruth braced herself for the look of disgust. But as those sharp amber eyes locked onto her pale, terrified face, she saw no pity and no revulsion. He looked at the trembling line of her shoulders. He looked at the bruised dignity in her blue eyes. He looked at the way her hands were hidden, knowing exactly what the cold stone steps had done to them. Garrett reached into his pocket. He pulled out the silver pocket watch. Click. He opened the casing, exposing the cracked crystal frozen forever at 4:15. He stared at the broken dial for 3 full seconds. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Then he snapped it shut and dropped it back into his coat. "Draw up the paper," Garrett said. Silas blinked, momentarily thrown by the lack of hesitation. "You agree? Just like that?" "Write it," Garrett said, his voice dangerously low. "Write that the debt is settled in full. Write that she belongs to no one in this house the moment the ink dries." Silas's smile returned, cruel and triumphant. "As you wish." For 3 agonizing minutes, the only sound was the scratching of Silas's pen. Ruth stood paralyzed. Her hand tightened around the carved wooden spool in her apron pocket, so hard her fingernails dug into her own flesh. She was being sold to a stranger who looked like he could snap a man's neck with his bare hands. A man who had just traded a fortune in debt for a maid. Silas slid the paper across the desk. Garrett stepped forward, took the pen, and signed his name with a heavy, illegible scrawl. He didn't even read the terms. "She's yours, Thorn," Silas said, folding his hands. "Try not to let her freeze to death before spring. It would be a waste of a good transaction." Garrett dropped the pen. He didn't look at Silas again. He turned completely, closing the distance between himself and Ruth. Up close, he was massive, blocking out the light from the parlor windows. He smelled of harsh winter air, wet canvas, and something deeply, inherently untamed. Ruth flinched, her body expecting a rough hand to grab her arm and drag her out. Garrett didn't touch her. He stopped 2 feet away, keeping a deliberate distance. "Do you have a coat?" he asked. Ruth stared at him, her lips parted in shock. Not an order, a question. "No, sir," she whispered, her voice barely working. "Just this." She gestured to the thin brown dress and the damp apron. Garrett's jaw tightened. A muscle feathered in his cheek near the faded scar. He looked back at Silas Abbott, and for a fraction of a second, Ruth saw something terrifying flash in the mountain man's eyes, a cold, calculated promise of violence that had absolutely nothing to do with a broken timber mill. "Then we leave now," Garrett said, returning his gaze to her. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't say goodbye to the master of the house. He simply turned and walked toward the grand oak doors, fully expecting her to follow. And Ruth Abbott, who had just been sold to clear a ruined man's ledger, took a shaky breath, loosened her grip on the wooden spool, and walked out into the freezing wind behind him. The heavy oak doors of Abbott Manor slammed shut behind them, and the sound was swallowed instantly by the howling wind. Ruth stood at the top of the stone steps, the bitter cold hitting her with the force of a physical blow. The gray suds from her scrub bucket had already frozen solid over the granite. Without the oppressive heat of the drawing room to protect her, the moisture in her coarse cotton apron turned into a sheet of ice against her thighs. The worn cuffs of her brown dress offered no defense against the wind cutting down from the timberline. Her teeth began to chatter, a violent, involuntary clicking she tried desperately to clamp down on. Garrett Thorne did not look back. He walked with long, purposeful strides across the frosted gravel, his heavy boots crunching loudly in the quiet afternoon. Ruth hurried to follow, her thin leather shoes slipping on the ice. She kept her head down, clutching the carved wooden spool in her apron pocket as if it could generate heat. She was a possession now, a piece of human ledger ink, traded for $3,000 of dead men's debt. Silas Abbott's final words echoed in her mind. "Take her out of my sight." She expected Garrett to lead her to a broken-down cart or force her to walk the long miles up the ridge. But at the edge of the Abbott property line, tied to a bare elm tree, stood a massive black draft horse hitched to a battered, heavy-duty timber wagon. It was not a carriage for a gentleman, but it was sturdy, built to survive the brutal mountain passes. Garrett unhitched the horse. He didn't speak. He didn't issue commands. He merely stood by the wagon wheel, waiting. Ruth approached the wagon, her entire body shaking. The wooden side of the cart was high, designed to hold rough-cut pine, not passengers. She reached up with her raw, bleeding hands, gripping the splintered wood. The moment her split knuckles took her weight, a sharp, white-hot pain shot up her arms. She gasped, her grip failing, and her knees buckled. She braced herself for the impact of the frozen ground. She braced herself for the shout, the curse, the sharp reprimand for being clumsy and useless. It never came. A hand caught her by the upper arm. The grip was impossibly strong, halting her fall instantly, but it wasn't cruel. Garrett held her steady, his amber-brown eyes dropping to her hands. The red lines on her knuckles had split open again, bright blood stark against her pale, freezing skin. He didn't say a word. He didn't offer pity. Instead, he placed his large hands firmly around her waist and lifted her off the ground as easily as if she were a sack of flour, setting her gently onto the wooden bench of the wagon. Ruth shrank back immediately, pulling her knees together, her eyes wide with the instinct of a hunted animal. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling violently from the cold and the fear. "I can climb. I can do it myself." Garrett stood by the wheel looking at her. Her lips were turning a faint, dangerous shade of blue. The gray apron was stiff with frost. Slowly, Garrett unbuttoned his dust-covered canvas coat. Ruth's breath hitched. In Abbott Manor, when a man removed his coat in front of a servant, it meant punishment, or worse. She pressed herself back against the wooden bench, her fingers digging into the worn fabric of her dress. Garrett pulled the heavy coat off his shoulders. Underneath, he wore only a faded flannel shirt over a thermal undershirt, entirely insufficient for the biting wind. He stepped up onto the wheel hub, leaned into the wagon, and dropped the heavy canvas coat squarely over Ruth's shaking shoulders. The weight of it almost knocked the breath out of her. It was massive, swallowing her small frame entirely. And it was warm. It smelled of pine sap, wood smoke, and cold mountain air. "Put your arms in," Garrett said. It wasn't a suggestion. Ruth stared at him, paralyzed. "Sir, you'll freeze. The wind is—" "I don't freeze," Garrett interrupted, his voice flat. "Put your arms in, or the cold will take your fingers before we reach the tree line." With trembling, bleeding hands, Ruth slid her arms into the oversized sleeves. The canvas was thick, lined with a rough wool that immediately began trapping her sparse body heat. It was the warmest thing she had worn in a decade. She pulled the collar up around her neck, instinctively burying her face in the thick fabric. Garrett reached under the wagon seat and pulled out a battered metal canteen. He uncapped it and held it out to her. "Drink," he ordered. Ruth took it with both hands, her raw knuckles protesting. The water was shockingly cold, but it cleared the dust and fear from her throat. When she tried to hand it back, he shook his head. "Keep it. We have 2 hours of climbing." Garrett climbed onto the bench beside her, taking the heavy leather reins in his bare hands. He didn't look at her again. He snapped the reins, and the massive draft horse leaned into the harness, pulling the heavy timber wagon forward onto the frozen trail. They left Abbott Manor behind. Ruth sat huddled in the corner of the bench, the oversized canvas coat acting as a fortress against the wind. She watched the grand stone pillars of her former prison fade into the gray afternoon mist. She turned her gaze to the man beside her. Garrett Thorne drove the wagon in absolute silence. The wind tore at his flannel shirt, whipping his dark hair across his forehead, but he didn't shiver. He sat impeccably straight, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the treacherous mountain road ahead. He was supposed to be a ruined man, a desperate beggar who had sold his pride to clear a debt. But as Ruth watched him navigate a dangerous, ice-slicked curve with effortless, quiet strength, a strange thought crept into her mind. Ruined men slouched. Defeated men complained about the cold. Garrett Thorne did neither. He handled the reins like a man who owned the very mountain they were climbing. And beneath the heavy canvas coat she was wearing, tucked into the inner pocket, Ruth felt the hard shape of something metallic. She carefully slipped her bruised fingers inside, tracing the cool edge of silver. It was a spare pocket watch, heavy and immaculate, completely at odds with the muddy boots and faded denim of the man sitting next to her. The wind howled through the high pines, bringing the first sharp flakes of a coming blizzard. Ruth gripped the carved wooden spool in her apron and the heavy silver watch in the coat, realizing with a sudden, quiet terror that the man who had bought her was hiding something far more dangerous than poverty. The blizzard hit them halfway up the ridge, a blinding wall of white that swallowed the trail and dropped the temperature to a lethal, biting extreme. Ruth huddled beneath Garrett's heavy canvas coat, her face buried in the wool-lined collar, shaking until her bones ached. Beside her, Garrett did not flinch. He navigated the treacherous, ice-slicked switchbacks by memory, his bare hands steady on the leather reins while the snow gathered in his dark hair. When the wagon finally ground to a halt, the light had already failed, leaving the mountain in deep, howling shadows. Through the swirling snow, Ruth made out the silhouette of a cabin. It sat tucked against a towering wall of granite, shielded from the worst of the northern wind. It wasn't a sprawling estate, and it possessed none of the polished elegance of Abbot Manor. It was made of massive, rough-hewn pine logs, built low and wide, designed purely to survive the brutal high country. Garrett secured the reins and jumped down. He led the massive draft horse to a sturdy lean-to attached to the side of the cabin, tossing a thick blanket over the animal's back. When he returned to the wagon, Ruth was struggling to stand. Her legs were numb, her thin leather shoes entirely frozen to the floorboards. Before she could force her raw hands to grip the icy side of the wagon, Garrett was there. He reached up, his large hands spanning her waist, and lifted her effortlessly through the falling snow. He didn't set her down in the freezing mud. He carried her the last 10 yards, kicking the heavy timber door open with his boot and stepping inside. He set her down gently on the plank floor, kicking the door shut behind them. The immediate absence of the screaming wind left a ringing silence in Ruth's ears. The cabin was pitch black and bitterly cold, smelling of old wood ash, dried pine, and leather. Instinct kicked in before logic. In Abbot Manor, standing idle meant a beating. Ruth's frozen hands fumbled in the dark, her panicked breath coming in short gasps. "Sir, the floor. Where is the broom? I can sweep the snow before it melts. I can—" "Stop." The word was low, barely more than a rumble in the dark, but it froze her in place. A match flared. The sudden burst of yellow light illuminated Garrett's face. The snow on his shoulders was already beginning to melt, dampening his flannel shirt. He held the match to a kerosene lantern on a heavy oak table, the warm glow pushing back the shadows. Ruth stood rigid near the door, trapped inside the oversized canvas coat, waiting for the inevitable order. She was property. She had been bought for $3,000. She was fully prepared to be told where to scrub, where to sleep, and what her grueling new life would entail. Garrett didn't look at her. He moved to the stone hearth, grabbing a handful of kindling and striking another match. Within seconds, a fire caught, the flames licking hungrily at the dry birch logs he stacked with quiet precision. The firelight danced across the rough timber walls, casting long, dancing shadows. He stood up, dusted his hands on his denim trousers, and finally turned to her. "Take the coat off," he said. Ruth swallowed hard. Her bruised fingers struggled with the heavy buttons, her joints stiff and agonizingly slow. Garrett watched her struggle for a moment, then crossed the room. He didn't swat her hands away. He simply reached out and, with deft, careful movements, unbuttoned the coat himself. He lifted it from her shoulders and draped it over a wooden chair near the hearth. "Sit," he told her, pointing to the chair. Ruth obeyed, her legs trembling as she sank into the seat. The heat from the fire hit her face, a shocking, glorious wave of warmth that made her eyes water. Garrett moved to a cast-iron pump at a small copper sink, an expensive luxury in a mountain cabin, though Ruth was too cold to notice the irregularity. He filled a tin basin with water, set it on the iron stove over the fire to warm, and then walked to a dark wooden cupboard. Ruth kept her hands tucked tightly in her apron, her thumb rubbing the carved wooden spool in her pocket. She watched him with wide, cautious eyes. He moved with a practiced, predatory grace, entirely silent on the wooden floorboards. He was a terrifying man to look at, rugged and scarred, yet he hadn't raised his voice once. When the water in the basin began to steam, Garrett took it off the stove with a thick cloth and brought it to her. He set it on a small wooden stool beside her chair. He dropped a clean white linen towel into her lap. "Soak your hands," he said quietly. Ruth stared at the steaming water. In 21 years, no one had ever drawn warm water for her. I can start supper, sir, if you point me to the pantry. I said, soak your hands. His amber-brown eyes met hers, leaving no room for argument. You're bleeding on the floor. Ruth looked down. It was true. The cracked skin on her knuckles had opened further in the freezing ride, slow drops of crimson staining the hem of her apron. Slowly, fearfully, she pulled her hands from her pockets and submerged them in the warm water. The heat stung viciously at first, then gave way to a deep, agonizing relief. A ragged sigh slipped past her lips, her eyes fluttering shut for just a second. When she opened them, Garrett was already at the stove, pouring something from a heavy cast-iron Dutch oven into a tin bowl. He brought it over, setting it on the table near her chair. It was a thick, rich venison stew, smelling of roasted root vegetables and wild thyme. Alongside it, he placed a thick slice of dark bread. He didn't hand her a spoon immediately. He pulled up a smaller stool, sitting across from her, the firelight catching the faded scar on his cheek. Eat, he said. Ruth pulled her hands from the basin, drying them carefully on the linen towel. She took the spoon with trembling fingers. She took one bite and then another, the rich, savory warmth spreading through her chest, chasing away the bone-deep chill of Abbott Manor. She ate quickly, instinctively waiting for the bowl to be snatched away, waiting for the catch. But Garrett just watched the fire, giving her the dignity of eating without being stared at. As the terror slowly receded, Ruth's observant eyes began to scan the cabin. It was a single large room, impeccably clean. But it was the details that made her pause. Silas Abbott had called him a beggar, a man who slept in the dirt. But the copper sink was polished. The lanterns were brass, not cheap tin. And the bed in the corner, a heavy four-poster frame built of solid cedar, was draped in a blanket that made Ruth's breath hitch. She had mended enough fine garments to recognize quality. The blanket was incredibly thick, a rich charcoal gray, woven from a wool so fine it looked like cashmere. It was worth more than her entire life's wages. And then she remembered the heavy, pristine silver pocket watch hidden in the coat she had worn. She looked back at Garrett. He was staring into the flames, his expression unreadable, a man perfectly at peace in the brutal isolation of the ridge. "Why did you buy me?" Ruth whispered. The question slipped out before she could stop it, driven by the sheer, terrifying confusion of a warm fire and a full stomach. Garrett slowly turned his head. His sharp eyes locked onto hers. He didn't look offended. He looked as if he had been waiting for the question. "I didn't buy you," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I bought a piece of paper, and I intend to burn it." Ruth froze, the spoon halting halfway to her mouth. "I don't understand. Mr. Bott said. "Silas Abbott is a fool who thinks he can put a price on human dignity," Garrett interrupted smoothly. He stood up, towering in the small space. He walked to the bed, picked up the magnificent charcoal blanket, and carried it over to her. He didn't toss it. He draped it carefully over her lap, the weight and softness of it utterly alien to her scarred hands. "You are not a servant here, Ruth," Garrett said, looking down at her. "Then what am I?" she asked, her voice shaking. Garrett held her gaze, the firelight casting a fierce, protective shadow across his face. "Safe," he said. He turned away, walking to the cabin door. He sat down on the floor, his back resting heavily against the heavy timber, placing his own body squarely between her and the raging blizzard outside. He pulled his hat down low over his eyes, crossing his arms over his chest. Ruth sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket fit for a king, holding her carved wooden spool. For the first time in her life, she was warm. But as she listened to the steady, quiet breathing of the dangerous man guarding the door, she realized she had absolutely no idea who Garrett Thorne truly was. 2 weeks passed, and the mountain did not kill them. In fact, for the first time in her 21 years, Ruth Abbott began to understand what it meant to simply live. The cabin on the ridge was an isolated fortress, buried under 3 feet of fresh powder. Yet inside, it was a sanctuary of heat and quiet routine. In Abbott Manor, silence was a warning. It meant Silas was calculating a punishment. Here, silence was just silence. It was the crackle of dry birch in the hearth. It was the soft scrape of Garrett's skinning knife as he carved a new handle for an axe. It was the sound of the wind losing its battle against the thick timber walls. Ruth's hands were healing. The deep, bleeding cracks on her knuckles had closed into pale pink lines. Garrett had given her a tin of beeswax and pine resin, leaving it on the table without a word. He never asked her to cook, never ordered her to clean, but she did both anyway. Not out of fear, but out of a desperate, quiet need to contribute to the only safe place she had ever known. But as the days bled into each other, the small irregularities of Garrett Thorne began to form a picture that frightened her in its complexity. He was supposed to be ruined, yet the pantry was stocked with imported salted meats, fine flour, and sugar. In the mornings, the cabin smelled of rich, dark-roasted coffee, a luxury Silas Abbott reserved only for Sundays and important guests. Garrett's clothes were faded canvas and denim, but his boots were custom-soled, built for endurance, and the hunting rifle leaning by the door was a beautifully engraved Winchester that cost more than a year's wages. Then came the afternoon on the lower trail. The snow had broken just enough for Garrett to take the heavy draft horse down to a lower cache to retrieve supplies. Ruth had insisted on coming, terrified that if she stayed alone in the cabin, the illusion of safety would vanish. She sat beside him on the wagon bench, wrapped in his massive canvas coat. 2 miles down the ridge, the trail narrowed tightly between a sheer rock face and a steep ravine. Coming up the pass was a group of 4 men on horseback. They were rough, unwashed men with rifles resting casually across their saddles, bounty hunters or hired guns, the kind of men who made their living through intimidation. Ruth froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She instinctively shrank back, pulling the heavy collar of the coat up. In the valley, men like this took what they wanted from ruined men. Garrett did not slow the draft horse. He did not reach for his rifle. He sat perfectly straight, his amber-brown eyes fixed on the approaching riders with a cold, terrifying indifference. As the distance closed, the leader of the riders, a scarred man with a vicious reputation in the valley, looked up and met Garrett's gaze. Ruth braced for violence. Instead, the man abruptly pulled his horse off the trail, forcing his men to back their mounts into the deep snow to make way. The leader took off his battered hat, holding it against his chest. "Afternoon, Mr. Thorne," the man said, his voice dropping in absolute, unquestioning respect. "Trail's clear to the south." Garrett gave a single, tight nod, driving the wagon past them without a word. Ruth stared at the men in the snow, her breath caught in her chest. They hadn't looked at Garrett with pity. They had looked at him with fear. The truth finally shattered the illusion completely 3 nights later. It was past midnight. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers. Ruth was asleep in the heavy cedar bed, wrapped in the fine charcoal blanket, while Garrett slept on a bedroll near the door, a boundary he had established on the first night and never once crossed. A sharp, heavy knock on the heavy timber door woke her instantly. Ruth bolted upright, panic seizing her throat. Silas! The thought hit her like a physical blow. Silas realized the contract was flawed. He's sent the sheriff. He's taking me back. Her hand shot under her pillow, her fingers closing frantically around her carved wooden spool as if it could anchor her to the cabin. Garrett was already on his feet. He didn't reach for his rifle. He moved to the door and threw the iron latch. 3 men stepped into the cabin, bringing a swirl of snow with them. Ruth pressed herself against the far wall, hiding in the deep shadows, holding her breath. These were not mountain men. They wore heavy wool overcoats, tailored suits, and polished boots. They looked like bankers from Denver. "Sorry for the hour, sir," the oldest man said, keeping his voice low as he dusted snow from his brimmed hat. "But the telegraph lines will be down by morning with this storm." "Is it done, Vance?" Garrett asked, his voice a low, commanding rumble that Ruth had never heard before. It was the voice of a man who owned entire cities. The man named Vance unclasped a leather briefcase. "It is. We purchased the final notes at 4 o'clock this afternoon." The creditors were desperate to unload them. "Silas Abbott's debt is now entirely owned by your private holding company. He believes the banks foreclosed on the High Pine Mill, just as you instructed us to leak." "And the deed?" "Transferred securely to your name, Mr. Thorne. High Pine is yours. The Abbott estate is yours. Silas Abbott is completely bankrupt, and he has absolutely no idea." Vance offered a tight smile. "He thinks you are a ruined man freezing on a ridge." Ruth clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. Her mind spun wildly. He wasn't ruined. The muddy boots, the faded denim, the rumors in the valley, it was all a mask. Garrett Thorne hadn't lost his empire. He had weaponized his disappearance. He had let Silas Abbott believe he was victorious, only to quietly buy the very ground beneath Silas's feet. "Leave the ledgers on the table," Garrett commanded. "Ride back to town before the pass closes." "Yes, Mr. Thorne." The men filed out as quickly as they had come. The heavy timber door shut, the iron latch sliding into place with a definitive clack. Ruth sat frozen in the shadows, her chest heaving. The man standing by the door was not a desperate beggar who had traded for a maid. He was a predator who had just swallowed a leviathan. Garrett turned from the door. He didn't look at the ledgers. His amber eyes found the dark corner of the bed where Ruth was hiding. He had known she was awake the entire time. He walked slowly to the table, lit the kerosene lantern, and sat down in the wooden chair. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavy silver pocket watch. He set it on the wood between them. "Come here, Ruth," he said softly. She hesitated for a long moment before pushing the heavy wool blanket aside. She walked to the table, her bare feet silent on the floorboards, and sat across from him. She looked at the watch, the cracked crystal, the hands frozen perfectly at 4:15. "You're not poor," she whispered, the reality still settling in her bones. "No," Garrett said simply. "You let Mr. Abbott humiliate you. You let him think you were a starving animal." Garrett traced the cracked glass of the watch with his thumb. 4:15, he said, his voice dropping into a dark, hollow register. 10 years ago, on a Tuesday afternoon, that was the exact minute my father suffered a stroke in Silas Abbott's drawing room. Silas had just handed him a forged contract, stealing the High Pine Mill and crushing my family's legacy. My father dropped this watch as he fell. Ruth looked at the broken silver, a sudden aching sadness twisting in her chest. Silas Abbott thinks wealth makes a man untouchable, Garrett said, looking up at her, the firelight reflecting fiercely in his eyes. He thinks he can buy dignity. He thinks he can trade a human life for a ledger entry. Garrett reached across the table, his rough, warm fingers gently covering her trembling hand. I didn't buy you, Ruth. I took you out of the blast radius. Because when the sun comes up tomorrow, I am going to tear Silas Abbott's world down to the bedrock. The morning after the blizzard broke bright and blindingly white. The wind had died, leaving the timberline ridge entombed in a profound, crystalline silence. Inside the cabin, the heavy cast-iron stove radiated a steady, fierce heat. Garrett stood by the frost-rimmed window, a tin cup of dark roasted coffee in his hand, his sharp amber eyes scanning the tree line below. Ruth sat at the heavy oak table. She was no longer wearing the coarse gray apron. Garrett had given her a thick flannel shirt of his own, which hung past her knees, and she was wrapped tightly in the fine charcoal blanket. Her hands rested on the table, the pale pink scars on her knuckles finely closed and healing. Beside her hand sat the carved wooden spool. She looked at Garrett's broad back. The revelation of the night before still hummed in her veins like a live wire. He was not a ruined man. He was the master of the very earth they stood on, and he had bought Silas Abbott's entire world out from under him. They're coming, Garrett said quietly. He didn't sound alarmed. He sounded like a man announcing the arrival of a storm he had prepared for all his life. He set his tin cup on the windowsill and walked to the door, pulling on his dust-covered canvas coat. Ruth's heart gave a violent, involuntary jolt. "Silas?" "Silas," Garrett confirmed. He picked up his Winchester rifle from the corner, but did not lever around into the chamber. He merely held it at his side, its polished walnut stock resting against his thigh. "Stay inside, Ruth." He opened the heavy timber door and stepped out onto the porch, leaving the door cracked just enough for her to hear. The crunch of struggling horses echoed up the trail. Ruth crept to the window, peering through a small patch of melted frost. 3 riders were fighting their way up the mountain path, their horses chest-deep in the fresh powder. At the front was Silas Abbott, flanked by 2 armed men Ruth recognized as hired enforcers from the valley. Silas looked nothing like the smug, untouchable titan who had sat behind his mahogany desk. He wore a fine velvet overcoat that was entirely useless against the mountain cold. His face was purple with rage and freezing wind, his tailored trousers soaked through with snow. Silas wrenched his exhausted horse to a halt at the edge of the clearing, glaring up at the cabin. "Thorn!" Silas bellowed, his voice cracking in the thin, icy air. Garrett stood on the porch, an immovable pillar of canvas and denim. He did not raise his voice. He didn't even grip the rifle with 2 hands. "You're trespassing on private land, Silas." "Private land?" Silas spat, his chest heaving as he spurred his horse a few feet closer. "You lying, thieving bastard! The bank chained my doors this morning. The sheriff handed me an eviction notice. They said my notes were sold to a private holding firm out of Denver, a firm registered to Garrett Thorne." "That is correct," Garrett said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried perfectly across the snow. "The debt is called in. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate Abbott Manor. I suggest you don't waste them riding up my mountain." "It's fraud!" Silas screamed, losing whatever polished veneer he had left. "You presented yourself as a bankrupt. You signed a legal contract in my drawing room under false pretenses. The marriage is void. The debt clearance is void. I'll see you hang in a federal court." "Take it to a judge," Garrett said smoothly. "Show him the paper where you traded a human life for $3,000. Tell the court how you sold your ward to a man you believed was a starving vagrant just to save your own ledger. Let's see how the magistrate views your morality, Silas." Silas's jaw worked furiously. He looked at the two armed men beside him, but neither made a move for their rifles. They were hired hands, and looking at the cold, unblinking eyes of Garrett Thorne, they knew perfectly well that any man who drew a weapon on this ridge would die in the snow. Realizing force would not work, Silas pivoted to the only leverage he thought he had left. "The girl," Silas demanded, pointing a trembling, gloved finger at the cabin. "The marriage contract is fraudulent, which means she is still legally my ward. She is my property, Thorne. You bring her out here right now. She's coming back to the valley with me. If you want her, you'll trade the deed to High Pine Mill to get her back." Ruth's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers dug into the wooden windowsill. Silas was trying to use her as a hostage. He was trying to drag her back to that freezing courtyard, back to the lye water and the beatings, just to ransom her for his stolen timber empire. For 9 years, that voice had commanded her every waking second. For 9 years, she had made herself invisible to survive it. "Take her out of my sight." Garrett's stance changed. It was a subtle shift, a slight lowering of his shoulders, but the air around the porch suddenly felt lethal. The Winchester in his hand twitched. Before Garrett could speak, the cabin door swung open. Ruth stepped out onto the porch. She did not wear the gray apron. She wore Garrett's oversized flannel shirt and the charcoal wool blanket draped over her shoulders like a queen's mantle. The freezing wind bit at her face, but she did not shiver. She walked up to Garrett's side, her bare feet silent on the frost-covered planks. Garrett looked down at her, a muscle feathering in his jaw. She shifted slightly, placing half his body between her and the men on horseback, a silent, absolute shield. "Ruth!" Silas barked, his eyes widening in desperate relief. "Get your coat, girl. You are coming with me. This man is a criminal. You belong to Abbott Manor." Ruth looked down at the man who had tormented her for nearly a decade. Stripped of his grand mahogany desk and his warm parlor, he was just a shivering, pathetic old man sitting on a freezing horse. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the carved wooden spool, her thumb resting on the faded initials. "I don't belong to Abbott Manor," Ruth said. Her voice was not a whisper. It rang out across the frozen clearing, clear and steady as a silver bell. "And I don't belong to you." "I am your legal guardian," Silas shouted, his horse dancing nervously backward. "You owe me for the food in your belly and the roof over your head. You will do as you are told, or I will have the sheriff drag you down this mountain in irons." Ruth didn't flinch. She felt Garrett's solid, warm presence beside her, an anchor in the storm. She looked Silas Abbott dead in the eye. "You sold me for a signature on a piece of paper," Ruth said, her voice dropping into a register of cold, quiet steel. You told Mr. Thorne to take me out of your sight. That transaction is final. If you send the sheriff to this ridge, I will tell him exactly what you did. And then I will watch Mr. Thorne buy the jailhouse and evict you from there, too." The two hired men exchanged a long, uneasy look. One of them slowly backed his horse away. Silas stared at Ruth, utterly paralyzed. The meek, bleeding girl on the stone steps was gone, replaced by a woman standing beside a titan, entirely beyond his reach. Garrett took half a step forward, the wood of the porch creaking under his boots. He reached into his pocket with his free hand and pulled out the silver pocket watch. He flipped it open. Click. "It's 8 in the morning, Silas," Garrett said, his voice echoing with absolute, unforgiving finality. "Which leaves you exactly 23 hours to pack your bags and get off my property." Silas Abbott's retreat down the mountain was a frantic, miserable scramble. Ruth watched through the frost-rimmed window of the cabin as the three horses disappeared into the white haze of the lower tree line, leaving nothing behind but deep, churning tracks in the snow. The silence that reclaimed the ridge was profound. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating quiet of a house waiting for a tyrant's temper to snap. It was the vast, breathing peace of the wilderness. Ruth stood by the window for a long time, the thick charcoal blanket still draped over her shoulders. She felt a strange, hollow lightness in her chest. For 9 years, Silas Abbott had been the center of her universe, a terrifying sun around which her entire existence orbited. And, in less than 5 minutes, with nothing more than a silver pocket watch and a quiet voice, Garrett Thorne had extinguished him completely. Garrett closed the heavy timber door and threw the iron latch. He leaned his Winchester rifle back into the corner, shook the melting snow from his canvas coat, and walked over to the cast-iron stove. He didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He simply picked up the blackened tin pot and poured 2 fresh cups of coffee, setting one gently on the oak table near Ruth. "Drink," he said softly. "You're shaking." Ruth looked down at her hands. She was trembling, but not from the cold. It was the adrenaline slowly leaching out of her blood, leaving behind a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion. She walked to the table, sat in the wooden chair, and wrapped her hands around the warm tin cup. Garrett sat across from her. The firelight caught the faded, thin scar on his cheekbone, softening the hard, angular lines of his face. He watched her with that same impossible patience, waiting for the terror to fully leave her eyes. "What happens now?" Ruth whispered, the steam from the coffee curling between them. "Now," Garrett said, his voice a low, steady rumble, "we wait for the past to clear, and then we go down to the valley to reclaim what belongs to us." 2 days later, the mountain sky broke into a brilliant, piercing blue. The heavy draft horse pulled the timber wagon down the winding, snow-packed trail, the iron-rimmed wheels crunching loudly in the frozen morning air. Ruth sat beside Garrett on the wooden bench, wrapped in his heavy canvas coat. But this time, she did not hide her face in the collar. She sat up straight, watching the sprawling expanse of the valley open up below them. They did not go to Abbott Manor first. Garrett drove the wagon straight to the towering iron gates of the High Pine Mill. The mill had been dead for weeks, its massive saws silent, its smokestacks cold. But as Garrett's wagon pulled into the muddy, snow-slushed yard, the heavy iron gates were already thrown wide open. A crowd of over 100 timber workers, foremen, and valley merchants had gathered in the freezing cold. As the black draft horse brought the wagon to a halt, a profound hush fell over the yard. Ruth recognized the faces in the crowd. These were the men who used to deliver flour and coal to Abbott Manor. These were the people who had walked past her while she scrubbed stone steps in the freezing rain, turning their heads, pretending she didn't exist because she was just the Abbott family's broken charity case. Now, as Garrett Thorne stepped down from the wagon, every single man in the yard slowly reached up and took off his hat. Garrett didn't acknowledge the crowd right away. He walked around the wagon, reached up, and placed his large hands firmly around Ruth's waist, lifting her down into the snowy yard. He kept his hand resting lightly, protectively, at the small of her back as they turned to face the mill. At the edge of the crowd, a small, pathetic procession was making its way toward the county road. Silas Abbott sat hunched in the back of a rented, open-air buckboard wagon, his velvet overcoat stained with mud. Beside him sat Beatrice, clutching a small leather valise, her face pale and stricken. They had been evicted. The grand mahogany desks, the imported perfumes, the warm drawing rooms, it was all gone. As the buckboard rolled past the mill gates, Beatrice looked up. Her eyes met Ruth's. For a fraction of a second, Beatrice's expression twisted into something resembling shock, followed immediately by a deep, hollow shame. Ruth stood tall, wrapped in the coat of the man who owned the entire valley, her head held high. She did not smile. She did not sneer. She simply watched them go, her dignity intact, untarnished by the cruelty they had subjected her to. Garrett guided Ruth through the crowd, the men parting silently to let them pass. He led her straight into the main overseer's office of the High Pine Mill. The room smelled of cedar dust and old paper. Garrett walked to the heavy oak desk at the center of the room, pulled out a key, and unlocked the top drawer. He reached inside and pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment. He walked back to Ruth and held it out to her. Ruth looked down at the paper. She recognized Silas Abbott's sharp, arrogant handwriting. It was the marriage contract. The ledger entry that had priced her life at $3,000. "Take it," Garrett said gently. Ruth's fingers trembled as she took the parchment. The ink felt heavy, a physical weight holding 9 years of trauma. "I told you on the first night that I bought a piece of paper, and I intended to burn it," Garrett said, his amber-brown eyes holding hers with absolute sincerity. "I meant it. There is a stove in the corner. Throw it in." Ruth stared at him, her breath catching. "If I burn it, the contract is gone. The marriage is void." "Yes," Garrett said quietly. "You will be a free woman, Ruth, with a generous account at the Denver bank under your own name. You can board a train tomorrow. You can go anywhere, buy any house, wear any dress, and no man will ever treat you as property again. You owe me nothing." Ruth looked from his steady, scarred face to the piece of paper in her hand. For 21 years she had been an unwanted burden. She had been commanded, berated, and sold. She had learned to survive by making herself small. But standing in this freezing cabin on the ridge, and now in this cedar-scented office, she had learned something entirely different. She had learned what it felt like to be protected without being owned. She thought of the steaming basin of water, the thick char, coal blanket, the way he slept with his back against the heavy timber door, putting his own body between her and the brutal world outside. He had built an empire from ruin, crushed his enemies with cold arithmetic, and yet he had given her the last drop of warm water in a freezing wagon. Ruth walked over to the cast-iron stove. She opened the heavy iron door, feeling the rush of heat against her face. She looked at Silas Abbott's signature one last time, then tossed the parchment into the flames. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished into ash. She closed the stove door with a sharp clack. When she turned around, Garrett was watching her, his chest rising and falling in a slow, heavy breath. He looked suddenly vulnerable, a titan who had just handed over his only shield. Ruth reached deep into the pocket of her faded brown dress. She pulled out the carved wooden sewing spool. It was worn smooth from years of being clutched in terror, the only anchor she had ever known. She walked slowly across the room, stopping inches away from Garrett. She reached out and gently placed the wooden spool on the edge of the oak desk. Then, she reached into the heavy canvas coat she still wore, slipping her fingers into the inner pocket. She pulled out the silver pocket watch. She set it on the desk, right next to the wooden spool. Garrett looked down at the two objects resting side by side. The broken legacy of a ruined timber baron, and the only possession of a discarded orphan. "I don't want to board a train," Ruth said, her voice soft but entirely unshakable. She looked up, meeting his sharp amber eyes. "I want to go home." Garrett's breath hitched. The hardened, dangerous mountain man who had brought a valley to its knees closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. When he opened them, the fierce, lonely isolation that had defined him for 10 years was gone. He didn't grab her. He didn't pull her into a desperate embrace. He simply reached out and took her hands in his. Her pale knuckles, scarred but healed, rested perfectly within his rough, calloused palms. He brought her hands to his chest, holding them against the steady, thundering beat of his heart. "Then let's go home, Ruth," Garrett whispered. They didn't stay in the Grand Abbot Manor. They sold it a week later, stripping the last remnant of Silas Abbott's cruelty from the earth. They rebuilt the High Pine Mill, paying the timber workers double the valley rate, refusing to let another soul freeze for a rich man's ledger. But every night, when the mountain winds howled and the snow buried the valley, the billionaire of the Timberline Ridge and his wife did not sleep in a mansion. They rode the heavy draft horse up the steep, winding trail, back to the rough-hewn pine cabin against the granite wall. They lit the kerosene lantern, built a roaring fire in the stone hearth, and sat together under a thick charcoal blanket. Because, or a man who had lost everything, and a woman who had never owned anything, wealth wasn't found in a bank account. Wealth was a heavy timber door that locked from the inside, a warm fire burning in the dark, and the absolute certainty that the person sitting beside you would never, ever walk away. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this journey. There is a profound beauty in a love born not from grand promises, but from quiet acts of mercy in a brutal world. For anyone who has ever felt cast aside, invisible, or treated as less than they are, remember Ruth's quiet strength and Garrett's unspoken vow. Sometimes the truest form of love is the simplest: a heavy coat in the freezing wind, a warm fire in the dark, and a safe place to finally rest your hands. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments, what does a safe place mean to you? Until next time, stay warm and take care of each other.